The injudicious prayers of Pombo the idolater. Pombo the idolater had prayed to Ammuz a simple prayer, a necessary prayer, such as even an idol of ivory could very easily grant, and Ammuz has not immediately granted it. Pombo had therefore prayed to Tharma for the overthrow of Ammuz, an idol friendly to Tharma, and in doing this offended against the etiquette of the gods. Tharma refused to grant the little prayer. Pombo prayed frantically to all the gods of idolatry, for though it was a simple matter, yet it was very necessary to a man. And gods that were older than Ammuz rejected the prayers of Pombo, and even gods that were younger and therefore of greater repute. He prayed to them one by one, and they all refused to hear him. Nor at first did he think at all of the subtle divine etiquette against which he had offended. It occurred to him all at once, as he prayed to his 50th idol, a little green jade god whom the Chinese know, that all the idols were in league against him. When Pombo discovered this, he resented his birth bitterly, and made lamentation, and alleged that he was lost. He might have been seen then, in any part of London, haunting curiosity shops, and places where they sold idols of ivory or of stone, for he dwelt in London with others of his race, though he was born in Burma, among those who hold Ganges holy. On drizzly evenings of November's worst, his haggard face could be seen in the glow of some shop pressed close against the glass, where he would supplicate some calm, cross-legged idol till policemen moved him on. And after closing hours back he would go to his dingy room, in that part of our capital where English is seldom spoken, to supplicate little idols of his own. And when Pombo's simple, necessary prayer was equally refused by the idols of museums, auction rooms, shops, then he took counsel with himself, and purchased incense, and burned it in a brazier before his own cheap little idols, and played the while upon an instrument such as that wherewith men charm snakes, and still the idols clung to their etiquette. Whether Pombo knew about this etiquette and considered it frivolous in the face of his need, or whether his need, now grown desperate, unhinged his mind, I know not, but Pombo the idolater took a stick and suddenly turned iconoclast. Pombo the iconoclast immediately left his house, leaving his idols to be swept away with the dust and so to mingle with man, and went to an arch-idolater of repute who carved idols out of rare stones, and put his case before him. The arch-idolater who made idols of his own rebuked Pombo in the name of man for having broken his idols. For hath not man made them? The arch-idolater said. And concerning the idols themselves he spoke long and learnedly, explaining divine etiquette, and how Pombo had offended, and how no idol in the world would listen to Pombo's prayer. When Pombo heard this he wept and made bitter outcry, and cursed the gods of ivory and the gods of jade, and the hand of man that made them. But most of all he cursed their etiquette, that had undone, as he said, an innocent man. So that at last that arch-idolater, who made idols of his own, stopped in his work upon an idol of jasper, for a king that was weary of wosh, and took compassion on Pombo, and told him that though no idol in the world would listen to his prayer, yet only a little way over the edge of it, a certain disreputable idol sat who knew nothing of etiquette, and granted prayers that no respectable god would ever consent to hear. When Pombo heard this, he took 2 handfuls of the arch-idolater's beard, and kissed them joyfully, and dried his tears, and became his old impertinent self again. And he that carved from jasper the usurper of Wosh explained how in the village of World's End, at the furthest end of Last Street, there is a hole that you take to be a well, close by the garden wall, but that if you lower yourself by your hands over the edge of the hole, and feel about with your feet till they find a ledge, that is the top step of a flight of stairs that takes you down over the edge of the world. For all that men know, those stairs may have a purpose and even a bottom step, said the arch-idolater, but discussion about the lower flights is idle. Then the teeth of Pombo chattered, for he feared the darkness. But he that made idols of his own explained that those stairs were always lit by the faint blue gloaming in which the world spins. Then, he said, You will go by lonely house, and under the bridge that leads from the house to nowhere, and whose purpose is not guessed. Thence past Maharion, the god of flowers, and his high priest, who is neither bird nor cat. And so you will come to the little idol Duth, the disreputable god that will grant your prayer. And he went on carving again at his idol of jasper for the king who was weary of Wosh. And Pombo thanked him and went singing away, for in his vernacular mind he thought that he had the gods. It is a long journey from London to World's End, and Pombo had no money left, and yet within 5 weeks he was strolling along Last Street. But how he contrived to get there I will not say, for it was not entirely honest. And Pombo found the well at the end of the garden beyond the end house of Last Street, and many thoughts ran through his mind as he hung by his hands from the edge. But chiefest of all those thoughts was one that said the gods were laughing at him through the mouth of the arch-idolater, their prophet, and the thought beat in his head till it ached like his wrists, and then he found the step. And Pombo walked downstairs. There, sure enough, was the gloaming in which the world spins, and the stars shone far off in it faintly. There was nothing before him as he went downstairs but that strange blue waste of gloaming, with its multitude of stars, and comets plunging through it on outward journeys, and comets returning home. And then he saw the lights of the bridge to nowhere, and all of a sudden he was in the glare of the shimmering parlor window of Lonely House, and he heard voices there pronouncing words, and the voices were nowise human, and but for his bitter need he had screamed and fled. Halfway between the voices and Maharion, whom he now saw standing out from the world, covered in rainbow halos, he perceived the weird grey beast that is neither cat nor bird. As Pombo hesitated, chilly with fear, he heard those voices grow louder in Lonely House, and at that he stealthily moved a few steps lower, and then rushed past the beast. The beast intently watched Maharion, hurling up bubbles that are every one a season of spring in unknown constellations, calling the swallows home to unimagined fields, watched him without even turning to look at Pombo, and saw him drop into the Lin Larna, the river that rises at the edge of the world, the golden pollen that sweetens the tide of the river and is carried away from the world to be a joy to the stars. And there before Pombo was the little disreputable god who cares nothing for etiquette, and will answer prayers that are refused by all the respectable idols. And whether the view of him at last excited Pombo's eagerness, or whether his need was greater than he could bear that it drove him so swiftly downstairs, or whether, as is most likely, he ran too fast past the beast, I do not know, and it does not matter to Pombo. But at any rate he could not stop, as he had designed, in attitude of prayer at the feet of Duth, but ran on past him down the narrowing steps, clutching at smooth, bare rocks till he fell from the world, as, when our hearts miss a beat, we fall in dreams and wake up with a dreadful jolt. But there was no waking up for Pombo, who still fell on towards the incurious stars, and his fate is even one with the fate of Slith. The Lute of Balmasharna. Things had grown too hot for Shard, captain of pirates, on all the seas that he knew. The ports of Spain were closed to him. They knew him in San Domingo. Men winked in Syracuse when he went by. The 2 kings of the Sicilies never smiled within an hour of speaking of him. There were huge rewards for his head in every capital city, with pictures of it for identification, and all the pictures were unflattering. Therefore Captain Shard decided that the time had come to tell his men the secret. Riding off Tenerife one night, he called them all together. He generously admitted that there were things in the past that might require explanation. The crowns that the princes of Aragon had sent to their nephews, the kings of the 2 Americas, had certainly never reached their most sacred majesties. Where, men might ask, were the eyes of Captain Stowbud? Who had been burning towns on the Patagonian seaboard? Why should such a ship as theirs choose pearls for cargo? Why so much blood on the decks and so many guns? And where was the Nancy, the Lark, or the Margaret Bell? Such questions as these, he urged, might be asked by the inquisitive, and if counsel for the defense should happen to be a fool, and unacquainted with the ways of the sea, they might become involved in troublesome legal formulae. And Bloody Bill, as they rudely called Mr. Gagg, a member of the crew, looked up at the sky and said that it was a windy night and looked like hanging. And some of those present thoughtfully stroked their necks while Captain Shard unfolded to them his plan. He said the time was come to quit the desperate Lark, for she was too well known to the navies of 4 kingdoms, and a 5th was getting to know her, and others had suspicions. More cutters than even Captain Shard suspected were already looking for her jolly black flag, with its neat skull and crossbones in yellow. There was a little archipelago that he knew of on the wrong side of the Sargasso Sea. There were but 30 islands there, bare, ordinary islands, but one of them floated. He had noticed it years ago, and had gone ashore and never told a soul, but had quietly anchored it with the anchor of his ship to the bottom of the sea, which just there was profoundly deep, and had made the thing the secret of his life, determining to marry and settle down there if it ever became impossible to earn his livelihood in the usual way at sea. When first he saw it, it was drifting slowly, with the wind in the tops of the trees. But if the cable had not rusted away, it should be still where he left it, and they would make a rudder and hollow out cabins below, and at night they would hoist sails to the trunks of the trees and sail wherever they liked. And all the pirates cheered, for they wanted to set their feet on land again, somewhere where the hangman would not come and jerk them off it at once. And bold men though they were, it was a strain seeing so many lights coming their way at night, even then, but it swerved away again and was lost in the mist. And Captain Shard said that they would need to get provisions first, and he, for one, intended to marry before he settled down. And so they should have one more fight before they left the ship, and sack the sea-coast city of Balmasharna, and take from it provisions for several years, while he himself would marry the Queen of the South. And again the pirates cheered, for often they had seen sea-coast Balmasharna, and had always envied its opulence from the sea. So they set all sail, and often altered their course, and dodged and fled from strange lights till dawn appeared, and all day long fled southwards. And by evening they saw the silver spires of slender Balmasharna, a city that was the glory of the coast. And in the midst of it, far away though they were, they saw the palace of the Queen of the South. And it was so full of windows all looking toward the sea, and they were so full of light, both from the sunset that was fading upon the water, and from candles that maids were lighting one by one, that it looked far off like a pearl, shimmering still in its heliotis shell, still wet from the sea. So Captain Shard and his pirates saw it, at evening over the water, and thought of rumors that said that Balmasharna was the loveliest city of the coasts of the world, and that its palace was lovelier even than Balmasharna, but for the Queen of the South rumor had no comparison. Then night came down and hid the silver spires, and Shard slipped on through the gathering darkness, until by midnight the piratic ship lay under the seaward battlements. And at the hour when sick men mostly die, and sentries on lonely ramparts stand to arms, exactly half an hour before dawn, Shard, with 2 rowing boats and half his crew, with craftily muffled oars, landed below the battlements. They were through the gateway of the palace itself before the alarm was sounded, and as soon as they heard the alarm, Shard's gunners at sea opened upon the town, and before the sleepy soldiery of Balmasharna knew whether the danger was from the land or the sea, Shard had successfully captured the Queen of the South. They would have looted all day that silver sea-coast city, but there appeared with dawn suspicious topsails just along the horizon. Therefore the captain with his queen went down to the shore at once and hastily re-embarked, and sailed away with what loot they had hurriedly got, and with fewer men, for they had to fight a good deal to get back to the boat. They cursed all day the interference of those ominous ships which steadily grew nearer. There were 6 ships at first, and that night they slipped away from all but 2. But all the next day those 2 were still in sight, and each of them had more guns than the desperate Lark. All the next night Shard dodged about the sea, but the 2 ships separated and one kept him in sight. And the next morning it was alone with Shard on the sea, and his archipelago was just in sight, the secret of his life. And Shard saw he must fight, and a bad fight it was, and yet it suited Shard's purpose, for he had more merry men when the fight began than he needed for his island. And they got it over before any other ship came up, and Shard put all adverse evidence out of the way, and came that night to the islands near the Sargasso Sea. Long before it was light the survivors of the crew were peering at the sea, and when dawn came there was the island, no bigger than 2 ships, straining hard at its anchor, with the wind and the tops of the trees. And then they landed and dug cabins below, and raised the anchor out of the deep sea, and soon they made the island what they called ship-shape. But the desperate Lark they sent away empty under full sail to sea, where more nations than Shard suspected were watching for her, and where she was presently captured by an admiral of Spain, who, when he found none of that infamous crew on board to hang by the neck from the yardarm, grew ill through disappointment. And Shard on his island offered the Queen of the South the choicest of the old wines of Provence, and foredormant gave her Indian jewels looted from galleons with treasure for Madrid, and spread a table where she dined in the sun, while in some cabin below he bade the least coarse of his mariners sing. Yet always she was morose and moody towards him, and often at evening he was heard to say that he wished he knew more about the ways of queens. So they lived for years, the pirates mostly gambling and drinking below, Captain Shard trying to please the Queen of the South, and she never wholly forgetting Balmasharna. When they needed new provisions they hoisted sails on the trees, and as long as no ship came in sight they scudded before the wind, with the water rippling over the beach of the island. But as soon as they sighted a ship the sails came down, and they became an ordinary uncharted rock. They mostly moved by night. Sometimes they hovered off sea-coast towns as of old, sometimes they boldly entered river mouths, and even attached themselves for a while to the mainland, whence they would plunder the neighborhood and escape again to sea. And if a ship was wrecked on their island of a night, they said it was all to the good. They grew very crafty in seamanship, and cunning in what they did, for they knew that any news of the desperate Lark's old crew would bring hangmen from the interior running down to every port. And no one is known to have found them out, or to have annexed their island. But a rumor arose and passed from port to port, and every place where sailors meet together, and even survives to this day, of a dangerous uncharted rock anywhere between Plymouth and the Horn, which would suddenly rise in the safest track of ships, and upon which vessels were supposed to have been wrecked, leaving, strangely enough, no evidence of their doom. There was a little speculation about it at first, till it was silenced by the chance remark of a man old with wandering. It is one of the mysteries that haunt the sea. And almost Captain Shard and the Queen of the South lived happily ever after, though still at evening those on watch in the trees would see their captain sit with a puzzled air, or hear him mutter now and again in a discontented way, "I wish I knew more about the ways of queens." Miss Cubbage and the Dragon of Romance. This tale is told in the balconies of Belgrave Square, and among the towers of Pont Street, men singing at evening in the Brompton Road. Little upon her 18th birthday thought Miss Cubbage, of number 12A, Prince of Wales Square, that before another year had gone its way, she would lose the sight of that unshapely oblong that was so long her home. And, had you told her further that within that year all trace of that so-called square, and of the day when her father was elected, by a thumping majority, to share in the guidance of the destinies of the empire, should utterly fade from her memory, she would merely have said in that affected voice of hers, "Go to." There was nothing about it in the daily press. The policy of her father's party had no provision for it. There was no hint of it in conversation at evening parties to which Miss Cubbage went. There was nothing to warn her at all that a loathsome dragon with golden scales that rattled as he went would have come up clean out of the prime of romance and gone by night, so far as we know, through Hammersmith, and come to Ardle Mansion, and then had turned to his left, which of course brought him to Miss Cubbage's father's house. There sat Miss Cubbage at evening on her balcony quite alone, waiting for her father to be made a baronet. She was wearing walking boots, and a hat, and a low-necked evening dress, for a painter was but just now painting her portrait, and neither she nor the painter saw anything odd in this strange combination. She did not notice the roar of the dragon's golden scales, nor distinguish above the manifold lights of London the small red glare of his eyes. He suddenly lifted his head, a blaze of gold, over the balcony. He did not appear a yellow dragon then, for his glistening scales reflected the beauty that London puts upon her only at evening and night. She screamed, but to no knight, nor knew what knight to call on, nor guessed where were the dragon's overthrowers of far romantic days, nor what mightier game they chased, or what wars they waged. Perchance they were busy even then, arming for Armageddon. Out of the balcony of her father's house in Prince of Wales Square, the painted dark green balcony that grew blacker every year, the dragon lifted Miss Cubbage and spread his rattling wings, and London fell away like an old fashion, and England fell away, and the smoke of its factories, and the round material world that goes humming round the sun, vexed and pursued by time, until there appeared the eternal and ancient lands of romance, lying low by mystical seas. You had not pictured Miss Cubbage stroking the golden head of one of the dragons of song, with one hand idly, while with the other she sometime played with pearls brought up from lonely places of the sea. They filled huge Haliotis shells with pearls, and laid them there beside her. They brought her emeralds which she set to flash among the tresses of her long black hair. They brought her threaded sapphires for her cloak. All this the princes of fable did, and the elves and the gnomes of myth. And partly she still lived, and partly she was one with long ago, and with those sacred tales that nurses tell, when all their children are good, and evening has come, and the fire is burning well, and the soft pat-pat of the snowflakes on the pane is like the furtive tread of fearful things in old enchanted woods. If at first she missed those dainty novelties among which she was reared, the old sufficient song of the mystical sea, singing of fairy lore, at first soothed and at last consoled her. Even she forgot those advertisements of pills that are so dear to England. Even she forgot political cant, and the things that one discusses, and the things that one does not, and had perforce to content herself with seeing sailing by huge golden-laden galleons with treasure for Madrid, and the merry skull and crossbones of the pirateers, and the tiny Nautilus setting out to sea, and ships of heroes trafficking in romance, or of princes seeking for enchanted isles. It was not by chains that the dragon kept her there, but by one of the spells of old. To one to whom the facilities of the daily press had for so long been accorded, spells would have palled, you would have said, and galleons after a time, and all things out of date. After a time, but whether the centuries passed her, or whether the years, or whether no time at all, she did not know. If anything indicated the passing of time, it was the rhythm of elfin horns blowing upon the heights. If the centuries went by her, the spell that bound her gave her also perennial youth, and kept alight forever the lantern by her side, and saved from decay the marble palace facing the mystical sea. And if no time went by her there at all, her single moment on those marvelous coasts was turned as it were to a crystal reflecting 1,000 scenes. If it was all a dream, it was a dream that knew no morning and no fading away. The tide roamed on and whispered of master and of myth, while near that captive lady, Asleep in his marble tank, the golden dragon dreamed. And a little way out from the coast, all that the dragon dreamed showed faintly in the mist that lay over the sea. He never dreamed of any rescuing night. So long as he dreamed, it was twilight. But when he came up nimbly out of his tank, night fell and starlight glistened on the dripping golden scales. There, he and his captive either defeated time or never encountered him at all, while in the world we know, raged Roncesvalles or battles yet to be. I know not to what part of the shore of romance he bore her. Perhaps she became one of those princesses of whom fables love to tell, but let it suffice that there she lived by the sea, and kings ruled, and demons ruled, and kings came again, and many cities returned to their native dust, and still she abided there, and still her marble palace passed not away, nor the power that there was in the dragon's spell. And only once did there ever come to her a message from the world that of old she knew. It came in a pearly ship across the mystical sea. It was from an old school friend that she had had in Putney. Merely a note, no more, in a little, neat, round hand. It said, "It is not proper for you to be there alone." The Quest of the Queen's Tears. Sylvia, Queen of the Woods, in her woodland palace, held court and made a mockery of her suitors. She would sing to them, she said. She would give them banquets. She would tell them tales of legendary days. Her jugglers should caper before them. Her army salute them. Her fools crack jests with them and make whimsical quips, only she could not love them. This was not the way, they said, to treat princes in their splendor, and mysterious troubadours concealing kingly names. It was not in accordance with fable. Myth had no precedent for it. She should have thrown her glove, they said, into some lion's den. She should have asked for a score of venomous heads of the serpents of Lycanthera, or demanded the death of any notable dragon, or sent them all upon some deadly quest. But that she could not love them, it was unheard of. It had no parallel in the annals of romance. And then she said that if they must needs have a quest, she would offer her hand to him who first should move her to tears, and the quest should be called, for reference in histories or song, the Quest of the Queen's Tears, and he that achieved them she would wed, be he only a petty duke of lands unknown to romance. And many were moved to anger, for they hoped for some bloody quest. But the old lord's chamberlain said, as they muttered among themselves in a far dark end of the chamber, that the quest was hard and wise, for that if she could ever weep, she might also love. They had known her all her childhood. She had never sighed. Many men had she seen, suitors and courtiers, and had never turned her head after one went by. Her beauty was as still sunsets of bitter evenings when all the world is frore, a wonder and a chill. She was as a sun-stricken mountain uplifted alone, all beautiful with ice, a desolate and lonely radiance late at evening far up beyond the comfortable world, not quite to be companioned by the stars, the doom of the mountaineer. If she could weep, they said, she could love, they said, and she smiled pleasantly on those ardent princes and troubadours concealing kingly names. Then one by one they told, each suitor prince, the story of his love, with outstretched hands, and kneeling on the knee, and very sorry and pitiful were the tales, so that often up in the galleries some maid of the palace wept. And very graciously she nodded her head like a listless magnolia in the deeps of the night, moving idly to all the breezes its glorious bloom. And when the princes had told their desperate loves, and had departed away with no other spoil than of their own tears only, even then there came the unknown troubadours, and told their tales in song, concealing their gracious names. And there was one, Acronian, clothed with rags, on which was the dust of roads, and underneath the rags was war-scarred armor, whereon were dints of blows. And when he stroked his harp and sang his song, in the gallery above maidens wept, and even old Lords Chamberlain whimpered among themselves, and thereafter laughed through their tears, and said, "It is easy to make old people weep, and to bring idle tears from lazy girls, but he will not set a-weeping the Queen of the Woods." And graciously she nodded, and he was the last, and disconsolate went away those dukes and princes, and troubadours in disguise. Yet Acronion pondered as he went away. King he was of Avarma, Lul, and Haf, overlord of Zarora and Hilly Chang, and duke of the dukedoms of Molong and Malash, none of them unfamiliar with romance, or unknown, or overlooked in the making of myth. He pondered as he went in his thin disguise. Now by those that do not remember their childhood, having other things to do, be it understood that underneath fairyland, which is, as all men know, at the edge of the world, there dwelleth the gladsome beast, a synonym he for joy. It is known how the lark in its zenith, children at play out of doors, good witches, and jolly old parents have all been compared, how aptly, with this very same gladsome beast. Only one crab he has, if I may use slang for a moment to make myself perfectly clear. Only one drawback, and that is that in the gladness of his heart he spoils the cabbages of the old man who looks after fairyland, and, of course, he eats men. It must further be understood that whoever may obtain the tears of the gladsome beast in a bowl, and become drunken upon them, may move all persons to shed tears of joy, so long as he remains inspired by the potion to sing or to make music. Now Acronion pondered in this wise, that if he could obtain the tears of the gladsome beast by means of his art, withholding him from violence by the spell of music, and if a friend should slay the gladsome beast before his weeping ceased, for an end must come to weeping, even with men, that so he might get safe away with the tears, and drink them before the Queen of the Woods, and move her to tears of joy. He sought out therefore a humble knightly man, who cared not for the beauty of Sylvia, Queen of the Woods, but had found a woodland maiden of his own, once long ago in summer. And the man's name was Erath, a subject of Acronion, a knight-at-arms of the Spear Guard. And together they set out through the fields of fable until they came to fairyland, a kingdom sunning itself, as all men know, for leagues along the edges of the world. And by a strange old pathway they came to the land they sought, through a wind blowing up the pathway, sheer from space with a kind of metallic taste from the roving stars. Even so they came to the windy house of thatch where dwells the old man who looks after fairyland, sitting by parlor windows that look away from the world. He made them welcome in his starward parlor, telling them tales of space, and when they named to him their perilous quest, he said it would be a charity to kill the gladsome beast, for he was clearly one of these that liked not its happy ways. And then he took them out through his back door, for the front door had no pathway, nor even a step. From it the old man used to empty his slops, sheer on to the Southern Cross. And so they came to the garden wherein his cabbages were, and those flowers that only blow in fairyland, turning their faces always towards the comet, and he pointed them out the way to the place he called underneath, where the gladsome beast had his lair. Then they maneuvered. Acronion was to go by the way of the steps, with his harp and an agate bowl, while Erath went round by a crag on the other side. Then the old man who looks after fairyland went back to his windy house, muttering angrily as he passed his cabbages, for he did not love the ways of the gladsome beast, and the two friends parted on their separate ways. Nothing perceived them but that ominous crow glutted overlong already upon the flesh of man. The wind blew bleak from the stars. At first there was dangerous climbing, and then Acronion gained the smooth broad steps that led from the edge to the lair, and at that moment heard at the top of the steps the continuous chuckles of the gladsome beast. He feared then that its mirth might be insuperable, not to be saddened by the most grievous song. Nevertheless, he did not turn back then, but softly climbed the stairs, and, placing the agate bowl upon a step, struck up the chaunt called Dolorous. It told of desolate, regretted things befallen happy cities long since in the prime of the world. It told of how the gods and beasts and men had long ago loved beautiful companions, and long ago in vain. It told of the golden host of happy hopes, but not of their achieving. It told how love scorned death, but told of death's laughter. The contented chuckles of the gladsome beast suddenly ceased in his lair. He rose and shook himself. He was still unhappy. Acronion still sang on the chaunt called Dolorous. The gladsome beast came mournfully up to him. Acronion ceased not for the sake of his panic, but still sang on. He sang of the malignity of time. 2 tears welled large in the eyes of the gladsome beast. Acronion moved the agate bowl to a suitable spot with his foot. He sang of autumn and of passing away. Then the beast wept as the floor hills weep in the thaw, and the tears splashed big into the agate bowl. Acronion desperately chaunted on. He told of the glad unnoticed things men see and do not see again, of sunlight beheld unheeded on faces now withered away. The bowl was full. Acronion was desperate. The beast was so close. Once he thought that its mouth was watering, but it was only the tears that had run on the lips of the beast. He felt as a morsel. The beast was ceasing to weep. He sang of worlds that had disappointed the gods, and all of a sudden, crash, and the staunch spear of Erath went home behind the shoulder, and the tears and the joyful ways of the gladsome beast were ended, and over forever. And carefully they carried the bowl of tears away, leaving the body of the gladsome beast as a change of diet for the ominous crow. And going by the windy house of thatch, they said farewell to the old man who looks after fairyland, who, when he heard of the deed, rubbed his hands together and mumbled again and again, "And a very good thing, too, my cabbages, my cabbages." And not long after, Acronion sang again in the sylvan palace of the Queen of the Woods, having first drunk all the tears in his agate bowl. And it was a gala night, and all the court were there, and ambassadors from the lands of legend and myth, and even some from terra cognita. And Acronion sang as he never sang before, and will not sing again. Oh, but dolorous, dolorous are all the ways of man. Few and fierce are his days, and the end trouble, and vain, vain his endeavor. And woman, who shall tell of it? Her doom is written with man's, by listless, careless gods with their faces to other spears. Somewhat thus he began, and then inspiration seized him, and all the trouble and the beauty of his song may not be set down by me. There was much of gladness in it, and all mingled with grief. It was like the way of man, it was like our destiny. Sobs arose at his song, sighs came back along echoes. Seneschals, soldiers sobbed, and a clear cry made the maidens. Like rain the tears came down from gallery to gallery. All around the Queen of the Woods was a storm of sobbing and sorrow, but no, she would not weep.